Hello everyone, my name is Henk Berg. I'm a cultural theorist and a professor of German at the University of Sheffield. I'm here in the University of Sheffield's John Carr Library to interview the political historian Koen Vossen. This is part of an event organized by the Centre for Dutch and Flemish Studies. Koen, this is the second part of our interview on political populism in the Netherlands. In the first part, we talked about the current and I guess still most famous Dutch populist politician Geert Wilders. I now want to go back in time and look at three politicians who I think can, in some senses at least, be considered his political predecessors. So going back in time, Pim Fortuyn, who was murdered in 2002. Before that, we had Hans Janmaat, whose career started sort of in the early 1980s. And before that, we had someone called Hendrik Koekoek, whose career sort of got going in roughly the late 1950s. Let's start with Koekoek. Many people won't have heard of him. So talk a little bit about what kind of character he was, what his political ideas were, what kind of party he represented.
Yeah, Hendrik Koekoek, Farmer Koekoek, as he was called, which translates into Farmer Cuckoo, which may sound a little bit strange in English probably, but Farmer Koekoek. He was the leader of a movement called the Free Farmers. And the Free Farmers was established after the Second World War, in which the Dutch government had decided to sanitize the Dutch agriculture. There were simply too much farmers in the Netherlands. And so they wanted to sanitize this, and they were in this process. They established a few organizations and institutions which should help these farmers. But there was a group of farmers who refused to work together with this board, with these institutions.
When you say sanitize, you mean kind of restructure the way agriculture is organized?
Yeah, restructure, more larger scale agriculture. So there were too much small farmers, small peasants, you could say. So like in 1930 in the Netherlands, there was about 20% of the people still worked in agriculture. So it was quite a lot. So they had to sanitize this. They had to find a solution for all these farmers after the Second World War. Quite a lot of farmers emigrated, among others to Canada, New Zealand, Australia. But there were, of course, also farmers who just stayed in the Netherlands, and they felt, well, they felt taken not really seriously. They felt haunted. They felt like they were almost persecuted, and their leader then became Farmer Koekoek. And Farmer Koekoek just said, okay, we are not going to work together with the government in restructuring agriculture, and we refuse to work together with this institute. And so this institute, it was also, if you look back a little bit, a strange situation. Farmers had to be member of this institute, and to be a member they had to pay some money. But there were farmers who just refused to pay this membership fee. And what that happened is, after a while, well, the judge decided, okay, if you refuse to pay, then we got fine and another fine. And then eventually there was an auction for their farms. And what then Farmer Koekoek did, and this, we're speaking now about 56, 57, he went with all the farmers to an auction, and then they bought the farm for not much money. So they intimidated everybody else. And they chased away sometimes also people who from the government, bureaucrats and something. So out of this whole, you could say, extra parliamentary organization came then a parliamentary party, the Farmers' Party, erected late 1950s, which then tried to mobilize these farmers, these free farmers, but also Koekoek was in that sense strategically although he had always this image of being this kind of simple farmer, he was in a way also clever. He knew I have to have more groups which I can mobilize. And there were a few groups in the Netherlands who were not really represented well. In the Netherlands then, we have to think this was a very stable political system, a pillarized system as it was called, with the different groups and different pillars. And
So you would have a Roman Catholic pillar. So if you were born a Roman Catholic, your parents were Roman Catholic, you would go to a Roman Catholic school, you would go to Roman Catholic sports clubs,
yeah,
you would read a Roman Catholic newspaper, listen to Roman Catholic radio and so on. You would have a Protestant pillar and so on. And these pillars, everyone kind of remained within their pillar.
yeah,
And at the same time, these different pillars had to find ways to work together,
yeah,
otherwise society would be terribly chaotic. So you had basically a very sort of compromise-based political culture. Is that right?
yeah, that's absolutely right. And what it was, within this pillarized system, there were a few groups who were not really represented within the pillars. Few groups. One group were former members of the fascist party in the Netherlands, the NSB, which during the Second World War, they collaborated with the Germans. After the Second World War, a lot of them got punished, and then in the 1950s they could vote again, but they were not represented. They were distrusted, of course, and well, they had to
How
find
many are
also
we talking about? Hundreds or thousands or
thousands. Well, absolutely thousands. So the NSB used to have
the
about 100,000.
National Socialistische Beweging,
Yeah, yeah.
the National Socialist Movement? Yes.
Movement. That's the term, and then there's the NSB, a little bit like let's say the British Union of Fascists. So
Yeah.
about 100,000 members in 1940. That's quite a lot, and and not all of them went to this party, but it was a group which was not really represented. There was a second group. These were people who returned from the Dutch East Indies after the decolonization. So Dutch people who sometimes lived there for generations, and then they went back to the Netherlands, and they were not really represented by people.
This is when you had when the Dutch East Indies, as it was then called, became independent in 1949.
Indonesia.
It became Indonesia, and these people didn't want to stay there, and they came to Holland.
They were even thrown out by Sukarno in the middle of the 50s. They came back to the Netherlands. There were also Moluccans among them who fought for a little bit like the Gurkhas for the British army, with the Moluccans for the Dutch army in the East Indies. A lot of them also came to the Netherlands. And Koekoek, from the beginning on, was also mobilizing people there. So then in 63, for the first time, he came into parliament. He found then, and not, to be honest, not with a lot of votes. So he had 3 seats, about 2%. But with 2% in the Netherlands, you come into parliament. And that was his takeoff. And then people found him interesting because he was, in a way, a little bit a cult figure. He was so much a traditional farmer, speaking with a very strong farmer accent, saying these farmer wisdoms in parliament, which was very unparliamentary. He often said to other parliamentarians, "You want to bet? We bet for a bottle of wine," or something like that, which was really not parliamentarian to do. So, and then in 1966, so he became popular among these different groups, non-pillarized groups, also people who were not really satisfied with the pillarized system. So he made a broader protest movement. And in 1966, there were municipal elections, and then he won quite some votes, also in cities like Amsterdam, more than 10%, in Haarlem, in Utrecht. So people, just as a protest candidate, he attracted a lot of votes. But then what happened is, then the media discovered that a lot of these new members of the Boerenpartij were former members of this fascist party, the NSB. And Koekoek refused to let them down. He said, "Oh, well, they're always complaining about these small details," and but this really did a lot of harm to this party, because then in the Netherlands, the Second World War in the Netherlands, especially in the 1960s, was a very, very sensitive issue. People were really, they were saying in the Netherlands, you were wrong or you were good. So, and these were the wrong
It
people.
was a very binary and simplistic way of looking at things. And
Yeah.
if you fell into the wrong category, then basically you were considered a traitor.
Yeah, absolutely. So this did a lot of harm to this party. But he stayed then in parliament until the 1981, just as a representative of small groups of farmers, especially in the east of the country.
Yeah.
So didn't have much impact, but was the first one to address immigration in 1972, and that had some success, but not immigration was not seen then as so much a problem. This became later. You could say the second figure then, Hans Janmaat, he then was the first real anti-immigration candidate in the Netherlands.
Yeah, we'll come on to Janmaat in a moment. So what Koekoek did was he sort of hoovered up, as it were, a lot of people who were unhappy about the existing political system and who had these very strong anti-establishment feelings.
Yeah.
Would you say that Koekoek's sort of rhetorical strategies, are they reminiscent of the kind of populist rhetorical strategies we see today? So deliberate taboo breaking, scandals to draw attention to yourself, extremist statements. Did he do that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, I think his strategy, maybe deliberate or not deliberate, was playing the anti-politician,
Mm-hmm.
the anti-politician. So the man who just says the strangest things in parliament, who speaks completely different than other politicians, uh, who, for example, who doesn't have a clear political program which is worked out. You don't need to have a program. It's just people who searching for a candidate to express their protest and also a little bit to, in French they call this épater le bourgeois. What is it?
Yeah,
And
so deliberate sort of yeah, causing scandals,
so
basically.
shocking the bourgeois.
Yeah, that's right.
Shocking the
Uh,
bourgeoisie. And how do you do it? Let's vote for this guy, because if we vote for this guy, then they will be shocked
yeah,
that we
yeah, yeah.
do that.
So,
And
so the,
nobody expects anything from him, of
Yeah, so I
course.
was going to ask, is it more like almost sort of, to use a different metaphor, sort of throwing a Molotov cocktail at the establishment, and people didn't really think that Koekoek would make things better, or did they also see kind of a positive program in him along the lines of finally we've got a common sense guy who's
Yeah.
going to come up with common sense solutions?
Some of his voters probably had these ideas, especially farmers. But if you interview these people, it was mostly like, yeah, not that we expected that much, but he tried to change things, and of course he didn't succeed. But what do you expect?
Yeah.
That's These are not people who are really much interested in politics. So their expectations are not so high.
Mhm. So let's talk a little bit about Hans Janmaat,
Yeah.
also in some senses, I guess, a predecessor to Geert Wilders. So Janmaat became um, uh, famous or infamous in the early 1980s. A lot of discussion about him, a lot of
Yeah.
resistance to him as well, even though politically he wasn't terribly successful.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about Janmaat, the person, and then also his ideas.
Yeah, Janmaat was a former teacher of, how do you call it, maatschappijleer, civil
So social studies,
social
yes,
studies,
yeah.
at a high school. Um, then got into politics. First a little bit at the Social Democrat Party, then he split off of the Social Democrat Party, and in the end he ended up at a party called the Center Party. center. That was always their slogan. We're not left, we're not right, we're the center party. And this party was really especially against immigration. That was their absolute main theme. And it attracted people from this, you could say, very small subculture of neo-fascists, skinheads, these kinds of, which in the Netherlands was much smaller than, for example, in the UK, with what was it, the late 70s, you had the National Front, I think. It's also not very big, but bigger than what we had in the Netherlands. But you see a little bit the same, what you also saw in the UK late 1970s in the Netherlands, that there was a very strong reaction among people who almost wanted to have an enemy. They wanted to have a fascist enemy because they considered themselves to be anti-fascists. They were in a way fighting the former battle, the battle which was in fact not the battle of the 1970s but of the 1930s. And they needed a fascist. They needed a fascist to project all their animosity on. And in the Netherlands, this became Janmaat then. Janmaat became the man who was the embodiment of revival of fascism in the Netherlands.
So we're still
Nobody
very
really
much this.
studied the man.
We talked about this thing earlier. This very simplistic view that Dutch people had for a very long time about the Second World War. As you
Yeah.
say, you were either goed or fout. You were right. You did the right thing, or you were basically a Nazi, and that went on for a very long time.
Yeah.
And then it was almost like a kind of sort of, to use a sort of semi-Freudian term, a kind of deferred disobedience. We didn't do anything about the Nazis. We didn't do anything against the Nazis. People were saying to themselves, well, we resisted. In reality, there wasn't all that much resistance against the Nazis. But now, finally, we've got this Janmaat, who is this terrible racist, and we can fight him.
Yeah, they sometimes call it the post-war resistance
Yes.
in the Netherlands. So since the 1960s, especially also among a younger generation, they were seeing fascists everywhere. So, and then there came this man, Janmaat, who then in 1981 just passed the electoral threshold with 1 seat, came into parliament, and there was a lot of protest and there was a lot of almost panic, or was moral panic among some groups. Oh, they're coming again. They're coming again. The fascists, there they are again.
The Nazis are back.
The Nazis are back. These kinds of things. And so what then happened is, in parliament also, if Janmaat spoke, most people left the room, left parliament. Nobody discussed with him. They gave him a room somewhere, far away, and he was completely isolated. Also in the media, nobody interviewed him. There was what the French call a cordon sanitaire. So
Although called a firewall nowadays.
yeah, firewall. Yeah. So, and it even went as far as that in the mid 1980s, there was a meeting between two groups who wanted to merge in the center party of Janmaat and another group, and they met in a small hotel in the center of the Netherlands. And the squatting movement in Amsterdam had heard about this, and they went there and set fire to the hotel. They were first just demonstrating, but somebody threw a Molotov cocktail. The hotel burned, and they had to flee. The people from the center party. One of the people even jumped out of a window and injured herself so much that that her leg had to be amputated.
Yes.
So this was a serious thing.
Yeah, this was done by a group of people, as you say. So the squatter movement.
Yeah.
Today we'd probably say sort of Antifa.
Yeah.
And how did the sort of politics and journalists react to this? Which I don't think they were trying to kill Janmaat.
No.
But the action they took, they set fire to the hotel.
Yeah.
There was this one woman who then, as you say, lost her leg. Her leg had to be amputated. It was basically, it could have ended up even worse. How did people react to this?
Yeah, well, there was some understanding of the whole. It was not like good job or no, absolutely not. And of course, people also condemned it, and this is not the way. More like this is not the way to combat those people.
Yeah.
But that we should combat them, that's fine. But okay, their intentions were good, but this is not the way. A little bit like that. That was kind of the atmosphere, and there had some legal consequences, but not that much, to be honest. So it was not seen at that moment as a political low point or something. No, it was seen as, yeah, the intentions were not that bad, but this is not the way you should do it.
And
That's
and as I
maybe how you can describe
Yeah,
the
and as I understand it, the other parliamentarians, none of them
yeah,
ever rang Janmaat to
no,
say, look, we're really sorry about what happened to
yeah,
your secretary. It's a woman whom he then later married, or sort of expressing any kind of sympathy
no,
whatsoever. Now, having said that, Janmaat did have some pretty unpleasant ideas.
yeah,
Talk about his criticism of what he called the multicultural society, his criticism of immigration,
yeah,
his sort of basically very racial views.
yeah.
Talk a little bit about those.
Yeah, well, they were kind of vulgar, you could say, and not really worked out thoroughly, you could say. But it was like the Netherlands is a country for white people, and not for immigrants. There are too many immigrants. They make use of our social security system, which is a bad thing. So it was, well, kind of straightforward, you could say. And he also sometimes made remarks which were plainly racist. So, for example, he once, when a Dutch football team was doing not so well in the European League, he said, well, that's because there are too many black people, black players in the team, which was kind of a stupid, a strange thing to say in the Netherlands, where the Dutch really benefited, of course, from a lot of
Yes.
black players, Ruud Gullit, Frank Rijkaard in the 1980s, for example. Virgil van Dijk nowadays. But then, so he made that kind of remarks, and he was uh, seen as a real vulgar man, as not a man who was taken seriously. The candidates he had were also a lot of people with criminal records.
Mm.
Now it was the lowest of the lowest, so to speak. So any decent person would not vote for such a party. That was kind of the idea. Although some say, I agree that immigration is a problem, voting for Janmaat was not
Yeah.
done.
And then
Or
interesting,
if you did it in real secrecy.
yeah, yes. And then kind of the cultural climate shifted in the 1990s. Um, it's interesting. So we're moving on to Pim Fortuyn
Yeah,
now, who I think is the most obvious precursor to Geert Wilders. It's interesting. Pim Fortuyn was murdered in 2002. It's also the year by coincidence, in which Janmaat died,
yeah,
I think. But talk a little bit about Pim Fortuyn, because he both benefited from a real shift in the cultural atmosphere in Holland, and also himself was behind that cultural
yeah.
shift.
So Pim Fortuyn was a typical, what we call a baby boomer in the Netherlands, born in 48. He in a Catholic family. He went to study sociology, as which was then very popular, of course, and he was really interested in Marxist sociology, as a lot of the baby boom students at that moment. He even was in the student movement, and so left wing, you
Mm,
could say. So in the beginning, he was active in the Social Democrat Party. He went to Groningen, wanted to have a career in academia, wrote his PhD. Um, And then, well, the P van de A, well, he noticed that he could not really make a career within the P van de A.
Yeah, this is the Dutch Labour Party.
The Dutch Labour
that he
Party.
was
Yeah,
a
absolutely.
member of. But
In the
then, as you say, he
1970s.
realized was a very ambitious man,
Very
and then
ambitious.
realized I'm not going to get to the top in this party.
Yeah, so he was so ambitious already as a high school pupil. He wrote a small note to the prime minister at that moment. How can I become prime minister? So he was really a man with a mission. He wanted to be, and his mother, that's then the idea, always also said to him, "You're a special kid, and you are on a mission." And first he wanted to be the Pope, and then later he thought, well, maybe politics is better. So Pim Fortuyn. He was also very early, he noticed that he was different from others, also because he was gay. And so also and he was also very flamboyant in that sense. Yeah? So then in the 1980s, he kind of shifted from the Social Democrat Party. He kind of followed the general trend in becoming the neoliberal entrepreneur. So he became an academic entrepreneur, so to speak. He went to Rotterdam in the Netherlands, also the economic powerhouse of the country, and suddenly began to write these neoliberal columns. The government should be much smaller, and it's all too much deliberation with trade unions and things like that. So Thatcherite, you could say.
That, by the way, is something that Geert Wilders kind of
Also
believed very early on as well.
Absolutely. He was also this Thatcherite kind of neoliberal. Yeah. So, but then so he tried to be a member of the Conservative Liberal Party, but also there they had no real space for Pim Fortuyn. Then he became more conservative. He began to stress cultural issues. He was very much influenced by the book, which also influenced Geert Wilders, The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington. The idea that the world is witnessing now a clash between different civilizations, and the main clash is then between Islam and a Western culture, and the risk is then that the Western culture has become too decadent to win this battle. So we should return to our basic values of the Christian, Judeo-Christian culture. These were the words that were often used. So Pim Fortuyn then took over that idea and then tried first also to become in the Christian Democrat Party, but he was also refused there, and then he thought, I'm going to do it myself. So he announced his candidacy in the very same month that both the former Prime Minister Wim Kok from the Labour Party said, I'm not going to run again, as the attacks on September 11th in Washington.
Yeah.
So
this is 2001. Yeah.
2001. You could say there it was, a strange kind of critical juncture in Dutch politics. So, and he knew that before already, there were a lot of surveys in the Netherlands which showed that a lot of Dutch were concerned about immigration. But it was not really addressed by political parties. They found this too sensitive, and it was kind of still this atmosphere of right and wrong, and this is the wrong part to politicize it.
We don't want to be racist and so on.
So, so this was also discussed then. Is this good? That is a taboo. And so Pim Fortuyn felt there's something there that I can use. And there was also a contingency, or a what do you call it? The liberals and the social democrats worked together, and it was all kind of, the idea was, well, it's almost the end of politics.
Yeah.
They're all agreed, there's this consensus, it's boring, and then Pim Fortuyn
It's
came.
boring and there's no real choice left.
There's no real choice left, and then Pim Fortuyn came as a flamboyant personality with his whole new viewpoints on immigration, on Islam, which was after 9/11, of course, suddenly a big issue. And well, the talk shows, which in the Netherlands was then very popular because commercial media, commercial television was introduced, and they discovered that a lot of people wanted to see people like Pim Fortuyn in their talk shows. So he was invited a lot. So, and then He did it much better on television than the candidate for the Labour Party, which was just a boring bureaucrat. And, so Pim Fortuyn became kind of a celebrity. And so he came with his campaign, and he of course, his opponents were then saying, oh, this is almost like the Dutch version of Jörg Haider in Austria, or of Berlusconi in Italy. We don't want this, or Le Pen. One BBC journalist, Tony Simpson, came to his house in Rotterdam, and when he compared Fortuyn van, do you agree with Jean-Marie Le Pen? Then Fortuyn sent him away. He said, okay, this is the end of the interview, you can go now. He was so angry. So, and
also, I'm pretty sure, very deliberately trying to create a scandal.
Yeah, well, he was very good in that. And what he also discovered, you could say, is that which was also new in the Netherlands, by offending journalists, he made them part of the elite. He said, okay, you journalists, you're all part of the same left-wing elite, and if I offend you, that's just a proof of me being an outsider. So then he said in an interview, as I already mentioned, I think he said, so if something would happen to me, there was, for example, he had received some threats, and he said in the interview, if something would happen to me, then the left wing is to blame. And then something happened, because you had this animal rights activist, Volkert van der Graaf, who suddenly got the silly idea of killing him. So he shot him 6th of May 2002, and immediately people said, one of the leaders of the LPF, which was led, said the bullet came from the left. And the bullet came from the left.
Again, a very sort of populist strategy to say, we've got the media, they're basically the mainstream media, there's the fake media, and they're sort of this left-wing, liberal, sort of do-gooders, not listening to ordinary people. And I think it was Pim Fortuyn who coined the phrase, the sort of left-wing church.
The left-wing church.
This has almost become this kind of, what in German they call Gutmenschentum. So all these do-gooders, it's almost become a religion in Holland.
Yeah. And to be honest, some politicians and pundits and commentators were sometimes a little bit too easy in using this racist card. And I can remember one of the leaders of the Social Liberal Party was in a debate. He even began to talk about Anne Frank and the secret annex and the things which should not happen again, in a debate with Pim Fortuyn, as if Pim Fortuyn was a Nazi who was again would be responsible for a new Anne Frank in the future.
Yes.
So that was also kind of exaggerated what then happened. So, but then you could say this really left an open wound in Dutch society, that the man who was finally, as he himself always said, dared to say what a lot of people thought, was then killed. One of his phrases was, I say what I think and I do what I say. So that was one of his famous phrases. And I dare to say these things, they should not be a taboo, and I'm addressing it, and if I don't address it, things will go wrong in this country. And so this resonated really. And what was, I think, very important for people was, if you compare it with Janmaat, this was a flamboyant professor in sociology, gay. He was very open also about all his adventures in gay bars, and almost exhibitionist about these things. And so he made it accepted in a way for also people who considered themselves quite progressive, because the Dutch consider themselves always as progressive, to vote for him. Because Fortuyn said, in order to protect the progressive Dutch culture, we have to fight against this conservative, backward Islam and
Yeah.
against immigration. Because I don't, as he once said, I don't want to do the whole gay emancipation over again.
Yeah.
So and a lot of people thought, well, yeah, that's and the whole dissatisfaction with immigration then was phrased in another way, which made it acceptable for them to. So he found, you could say, the formula.
Yeah, so almost sort of flipping the script. So instead of saying, I'm not the one who's intolerant, I'm the one who's defending
Yeah,
tolerance. But in order to do that, we've got to quote unquote deal with these people who are coming over
yeah.
here and who have all these backward ideas. Why do you think, I mean, this is a very complex question, but why do you think that his ideas in the 1990s and in very, very early 2000s, why did they resonate? Whereas Koekoek's ideas and Janmaat's ideas, they got a lot of criticism, they were discussed in the press, but they really never went anywhere electorally. Pim Fortuyn, he's murdered, and then his party suddenly does enormously well. And even before that, as you say, people were discussing his ideas. He was in the news all the time. And there were a lot of voters who were, a lot of Dutch people who were attracted to these ideas. How do you explain that shift, which which came already before 9/11?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, more structural is the fact that since the 1960s, you see a high volatility among Dutch voters. So, electoral volatility, which just means in the Netherlands we call it floating voters. They go from one party to another.
Hmm.
They are not loyal to a party anymore. So the Catholic who always voted Catholic, well, his son or daughter, they left church and they're not voting Catholic again. They vote one time liberal and then they vote more conservative liberal and then more left. So this also gave opportunities to a lot of new parties. So this is one thing. So the market was open, more open than people realized probably in the 1990s. As long as the traditional parties delivered, and for a while in the 1990s they did deliver, well, they could have their voters. But as soon as these voters were not loyal, they were just looking each time, okay, are they delivering? Are they not? Then we are away just as
We go
easy.
elsewhere. Yeah.
We go elsewhere. So that's one, I think, one thing. The second is probably that the whole idea of immigration being a subject which you cannot address was already in the 1990s changing with a man like Bolkestein, which was the leader of the Conservative Liberal Party, who addressed the issue. There were various other intellectuals. So this whole idea, what Pim Fortuyn often said, that we are not allowed to speak about these things, was simply not true, because it was discussed. And it was often said that, oh, you have to be careful. And of course, there was in the 1980s, there had been this movement of being too much that anti-fascism uh, against a Janmaat, but it's just too simple to portray a society as if there's just one trend. There was also this trend of, from the 1990s, of already discussing immigration. But it is rhetorically, well, you know everything about this, of course, but rhetorically always very strong to exaggerate, to say, you're not allowed to speak about these things. Well, you were allowed.
Having
Even
said,
now, people say it, and we
yeah,
are discussing it for 25 years, and even now,
yeah,
still, people say we're not allowed to speak about these things.
yeah. Having said that, I mean, Bolkestein, he, it's not true that he was a lone voice, but there was a lot of criticism of him. Is it not
Absolutely.
the case, this is a question rather than a statement, that if you look at the way Dutch people dealt with immigration, and again, tell me if this is a simplification or not, that for a long time, so there were these there were these gangs basically,
Hmm.
uh, that consisted for a large part of Moroccans, people of Moroccan descent. And then for a long time, you could talk about the crime, but not about the cultural background.
Mhm.
That then changed, I sometimes think, and it became, okay, we can talk about the cultural background, but in terms of it's not surprising that these people turn to crime because they're so discriminated against.
Mhm.
And then instead of saying, okay, we've got here a group of Moroccan people who commit crimes, as do Dutch people, and just one element of that is their cultural background.
Mhm.
Instead of sort of arriving at that, you then had this pendulum swing completely in the opposite direction, where it went
Mhm.
from in the past saying we can't talk about it or these people are discriminated against. That then became we want to get rid of all these people. And there
Mhm.
was this specific expression, I'm not going to repeat it, I'm not going to say it in public, about Moroccans, this very sort of discriminatory way
Mhm.
of designating them. Um, isn't it not isn't there this some truth in the idea that for even into the 1990s, you had this kind of very liberal, progressive do-goodism in Holland about immigration?
Yes, I think the in English the term some truth I always find very nice because it exactly says what I would
Yes, I'm
say.
very good at hedging in that way. Yes.
Yeah, so some truth, yeah, you can say there is some truth in it, but it's not the only truth, you know? It's
Okay.
not
Yeah.
like it's the absolute truth. Yeah, you can find absolutely look, the Dutch in the beginning had the tradition of pillarization. So what you saw when the Muslims came into the Netherlands was the idea among some, well, let them build a pillar.
Yeah.
Let them emancipate themselves by pillarizations, by their own schools, and we discuss then with the elites of these pillars. And okay, that's how it worked in the past. Let's do it again. But this didn't work the exact same way. So you could say the reflex they had in the beginning, and that's always what you see, that people always are, and that's logic that they do because they're always looking at the past. How did we do it in the past? And they always try to use the same routine. But this routine did not work anymore, of course, especially not for Muslims, which most of them were born outside of the Netherlands, didn't speak the language very good. So all these things, yeah. So in policy making, maybe this whole pillarization idea was a mistake, if you look back. Um, and yes, the Netherlands changed very quickly in the 1970s, in the 1980s, so that there would be some kind of political reaction to these changes. Well, that's quite logical, you know, it's
Mm.
quite normal that there would be something like that. But then in this political reaction, you see then all these exaggerations that nobody could talk about these things. Well, it was discussed. Okay, you get criticized if you address the issue, but you always get criticized. You know, that's part of the discussion that you get criticized. So
That is a very popular sort of
yeah,
one of their favorite
but
strategies
But
as
what
well.
did I think what did a lot of harm is probably this whole very strong anti-fascist, anti-racist groups in the 1980s who really claimed to defend democracy, and maybe that, if you look back, was also exaggerated. But this was also again a reaction on the Second World War, and so there you see
Yeah.
how things always look back and if you study them.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, so you gave a lecture this morning for our students where you also talked about the role of social media in the rise of populism. We don't have much time left, but maybe you can say a little bit about that because that's, I think, one of the drivers behind political populism that we find in other countries as well.
Yeah. So, in fact, I think you can already start with the introduction of commercial media everywhere, in which there's a commercial media logic appearing, in which it's only about one thing, and it's about selling your paper, selling your programs. And to sell things, you have to uh, uh, entertain people.
Yeah.
You have to entertain people, and people are more entertained and not educate them. So this whole idea which you still had in the 1960s of educating people, trying to teach them things, this kind of fell away and was replaced by this idea, well, people just want to hear what they already think. And we have to make this stronger and not take away prejudice, but confirm their prejudice in a way.
So that kind of started in the 1980s, you'll say?
Yeah, it's the 1990s in the Netherlands. You see this slowly appearing more and more. Also, expert knowledge is less important. And the man or woman in the street is as important as the expert knowledge.
Where does that come from?
Yeah, that's, some people say it's postmodernism, even, that the idea it's only just an opinion. Also, science is just an opinion. Maybe. I'm not sure about that, but this whole idea of which then with social media becomes stronger is that there is no real gatekeeping anymore. So there are no people who saying, okay, this is fake news, or this is just not such a strong argument, we're not going to publish this, or this is just a plain lie, or this is just too insulting. Or in social media everything is possible, there's no gatekeeping anymore, and the normal commercial media have to answer to that, and they are taking over also a little bit this vulgar style of social media, and this had a huge impact, of course, on politics, where, because also politicians can follow a bypass strategy, as they call it, so they don't need the media anymore.
Yeah.
They have their own Twitter account or X account. It's like Geert Wilders. Geert Wilders hardly gives interviews in the media. He has his own X account. Well, it's Donald Trump also.
There's an interesting paradox there in a sense, isn't there? Because on the one hand, we've got people, you talked about that this morning, who are better educated than they used to be, who are more independent, who have more agency,
Yeah.
which is all to the good. But then at the same time, then they think, well, I know it all. I don't need the experts.
Yeah.
And then you get this kind of so again, an unwillingness to listen to sociologists and historians and so on, as the Brexiteer Michael Gove famously said, British people have had enough of the experts. So there's that, and then at the same time in social media, you've got this really weird sort of I was going to say mixture. That's not a sort of combination or struggling to find the right word here. Let's stick with combination of the private and the public. So on the one hand, these are public messages, but on the other hand, you're just expressing an opinion or kind of venting, being angry as you would in a pub, and that then becomes part of public discourse, which on the whole is probably also very unhealthy.
Well, you can hear the silent majority.
Yes,
literally.
the
So
silent majority is no longer silent.
yeah, it's no longer silent anymore. You can read everything, and also you can directly respond to everything. Also, your most emotional first reaction, which then leads, and you see it in the Netherlands, but probably you see it everywhere, to a lot of insults to politicians. Also, I'm gonna shoot you in the head. You all these kinds of things. It happens a lot in the Netherlands. So if you see what politicians nowadays get kind of messages they get nowadays, it's unbelievable. It's every day hundreds and hundreds of hate mail and whatever.
It's hard to believe that anyone still wants to be a politician.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see it in the Netherlands, especially women, because women, and especially women who are a little bit left wing, well, they are. I deeply respect them. Only not per se for the political viewpoints, but that they dare to do so. Because if you see what kind of messages they got,
they're the kind of verbal abuse they are.
Absolutely. Also, female experts. I know. So in the Dutch media, I sometimes also talk about populism. I don't get many messages, sometimes a little bit, but my female colleagues, immediately they get message, oh, what do you think, you ugly bitch? And it's awful.
Yeah, and again, it's things that you really wouldn't, that people might have felt in the past, but they wouldn't have said it.
No.
And even if they did say it in the pub, they would have no real opportunity to express it publicly. And now all they have to do is go online.
And then sometimes they, when these people are confronted, because some of these politicians just go to court to just sue these people, and they come into court, and then they are just very simple persons who didn't realize that this had an effect what they did.
It's extraordinary. So this is the second part was the second part of our interview. In the third and final part, I want to talk a little bit about the question of whether there are any lessons we can learn from the rise of populism in the Netherlands. Thanks, Koen.